Right on. Thank you very much, Jen, for that wonderful introduction. My mic is now live. Excellent. Never been recorded in front of a live studio audience before, so this is a bit of a treat for me. Thank you very much. It's quite an honor to be representing the Alberta Society of Professional Biologists. It's quite an honor to be asked by your professional association to come and give a talk on wetlands. So I'm very honored for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. The Alberta Wetlands course is something that I've been teaching at my private consulting company for many, many years. The course that I give typically started out as in-house training at our shop, probably in 2005 or 2006, and then it quickly evolved into becoming the course that it is today. And so you're getting a small snapshot of that, the high points, if you will, on classification and policy around wetlands. So as Jen has introduced me as, I'm a professional biologist. I've been a member of the society. Gosh, I think it was ever since I came out here. I became a biologist in training right away when I was in grad school. And of course, I always dreamed about becoming a biologist. I'd studied lakes and rivers in Ontario and came out to Alberta 20 years ago to study Frank Lake, which is one of the largest restoration projects that Ducks Unlimited has just south of High River. And it was funny, you know, in High River that year, there was a big flood. And there was a flood again in the next couple years later. And of course, there's been another big flood just recently as well. So that got me to thinking about wetlands and flooding and how that all goes. So it's very interesting how a lot of these things that I used to study are still very much hot topics. So that's probably enough you want to know about myself. I'm a qualified wetland aquatic environment specialist, or I call myself a QACE. And again, I did my undergraduate work on Frank Lake with Ducks Unlimited. And professionally, I started up Aquality in 2000. And been involved with the Alberta Water Council, Alberta Lake Management Society, Trout Unlimited, Inside Education with doing some environmental education work, and most recently I'm a judge with the Emerald Foundation. So I'm quite proud of the groups that I'm involved with, and they all, of course, shape my professional dealings as well. But my day-to-day job is as a professional consultant with Aquality Environmental. So this is going to be the most exciting 90 minutes of the rest of your life. I promise, all of you. It's going to be really fun. We're going to have a few things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about wetlands in Alberta. We're going to talk about peatlands, talk about prairie pothole wetlands, so wetlands in the north, wetlands in the south. We're going to talk about some of the wetland classification systems. We're going to talk about functions of wetlands and riparian areas. Then we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the regulatory environment. And I wish I knew now what I could have known when I was in university a long time ago, that there's people in consulting companies and their day-to-day job, all they do is deal with legislation and the environment. There's guys that just drive around in pickup trucks out in the bush, just getting approvals for well sites to go in, for wetlands to be approved to be disturbed, for Water Act approvals, all these sort of things. So all this regulatory environment business is quite fascinating for me. And this is something, of course, you don't learn anything about while you're in school. And this is all kind of on-the-job training once you get out of school and into an environmental consulting company, because unless you've taken environmental law, you don't get exposure in all this. And you really don't understand the ins and outs of how that law is applied until you get into consulting and you start doing that kind of work. So I'll talk about the federal regulations that affect wetlands. So if you're dealing an application or something that deals with an impact to a wetland, is there fisheries concerns? Is there migratory bird concerns? Because let's face it, there's lots of birds that live in wetlands. And then there's all the provincial issues as well. So there's a PIA, the Water Act, the Provincial Fisheries Act as well, the Public Lands Act, the Surveys Act, Municipal Government Act. And most recently, if you deal with upstream oil and gas, the oil sands or coal, there's this whole brand new regulator called REDA, or AER, Alberta Energy Regulator, and their new act is the Responsible Energy Development Act. And of course, they're responsible for looking after all the issues dealing with that sector around water as well. So that's a whole big change in our regulatory environment. So, and then of course other policies and strategies. We've got the land use framework, cumulative effects management. We've got water for life. Of course, the provincial water strategy that the province has. We talk about riparian land conservation and management. There's Alberta wetland policy and regulations, and then of course wetland mitigation, compensation, and restoration. And I hope I get to getting to the end of that. And of course I'll take any questions at the end around how we do compensation in the province, because it's a rather complex issue. But essentially, it's money that goes to Ducks Unlimited for compensation if you can't avoid or minimize an impact to a wetland. That's how that works. So one of the things I've learned with my dealings with the Alberta Water Council is before we start talking about something, you'd better identify what that something is. One of the most difficult things that I had to do was sit down with some engineers one day and determine what non-point source pollution was. Any guesses what non-point source pollution is? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Of course, I'm a smart ass, so I say, well, it's anything that's not point source pollution, right? That's the non-point source stuff. But it was fun to sit around with some people talking about stormwater. Is stormwater a non-point source pollution? Most people would say, well, yeah, Jay. But then the engineer would pipe up and say, well, yeah, but that water came out of a pipe. So that's a point source. And so I had to rethink what I thought stormwater was. Wetlands are kind of like that. Wetlands are very difficult things to manage because they're very nebulous. And of course, the old adage in Alberta is, well, you only got to know two things about wetlands, right? There's only two kinds of wetlands in Alberta. You got muskeg and you got sloughs, right? That's all you need to know, just muskegs and sloughs. That's all you need to know about. And of course, sloughs should be drained, and muskegs, that tough stuff that's hard to quad through, right? Well, I'm here to tell you today there's no such thing as muskeg or sloughs. You will not find a legal definition for either of those terms in our Water Act or anyplace else. So one of my big messages when I give my course, we want to make sure that the people who are dealing with wetlands in your organization or the people that you talk to on a day-to-day basis understand that wetlands are a very unique type of water body. We have a provincial definition from the Wetland Restoration Compensation Guide because there is no legal definition for wetlands. If you look in the Water Act, we spend lots of time talking about what water is, but we're very silent on what wetlands are. So this is the best definition you're going to get in the province. So the definition for wetlands is land that is saturated with water long enough to promote wetland or aquatic processes, as indicated by poorly drained soils, water-loving vegetation, and various kinds of biological activity adapted to a wet environment. So if you want to understand wetlands or you want to study wetlands, you need to be good at three things. You need to be good at veg, you need to be good at soils, and you need to be good at hydrology. So that whole quace business, it's really tough for people to be good quaces because to be a good quace, you need to be a good botanist, you need to be a good hydrologist, and you need to be good on your soils as well. So when we certify quaces going forward, they're going to have to be good at those three things. And you can't just be a good soils person and think you're a wetlands identifier. Because a lot of wetlands that I look at, the soil component's completely obliterated because it's been farmed through for the last 20 years. So you have to understand your water-loving vegetation, you have to understand your hydrology. So it's really important to know those three components when you're going forward. The other part about wetlands is they're a true test of our laws because they're not very permanent. Sylvan Lake is Sylvan Lake is Sylvan Lake. It's not going anywhere. But imagine if Sylvan Lake dried up every other year or every 3 or 4 years and you were able to farm through it or do something with it. So it's kind of interesting. A lot of people will say to me, farmers will say to me, we got a lot of rain last year. A whole bunch more wetlands this spring. It's like, nope, there's no more wetlands. There's still the same number of wetlands that there have always been. They just haven't expressed themselves in the last few years that have been dry. And another great analogy that I was given recently was, just because a sponge isn't wet doesn't mean it's not a sponge anymore. So there's something else you can kind of use when you're dealing with your clients. In true Canadian fashion, what we have lots of, like lots of water, Canadians tend to waste. And it's no different than with wetlands. Canada has the most wetlands of any country in the world. Yay us. 4% of the world's landscape is covered in wetland. 14% of Canada's landscape is covered with wetlands. And that number goes up to 17% in Alberta. So we have a very large aerial coverage of wetlands. And you can see Canada versus Russia on the side there. And we just sort of edged them out in aerial size. So in Alberta, about 17% of our landscape is covered with wetlands. Most of these wetlands are peatlands or organic wetlands. Most of our peatlands are fens. Almost 70% are fens, about a quarter are bogs, and a very small number are marshes and swamps. The main peatland region is in northern Alberta and encompasses the Caribou Mountains, Birch Mountains, and Cameron Hills. almost 70% of the landscape is peatland up there. And a lot of our bogs are underlain by permafrost. And then, of course, in the drier part of the province, that corridor east of Highway 2 between Edmonton and Calgary, we have a very different kind of wetland there. And those are our prairie pothole wetlands. And those are our marshes that go through those wet and dry, rapid wet and dry cycles because we live in such a dry province. There's a Ramsar Convention that recognizes wetlands of international importance. 4 of those are in Alberta. You can see them here, but one is in Beaver Hill Lake, Wood Buffalo Park, the Peace Athabasca Delta, Hayzama Lake as well. So Ramsar was a convention that was signed in Iran in the early 70s, and it recognizes internationally significant wetlands. Wetlands are extremely important for a variety of reasons. We're going to be talking about why wetlands are important in terms of functions and benefits later on in the presentation. But certainly from a biodiversity perspective, wetlands are home to over 600 species of plants and animals and are only second to rainforests with the levels of biodiversity that they harbor. As much as 50% of the Pacific flyway of birds go through our prairie pothole region wetlands, so they're incredibly important that way. And about 70% of the species in this province use wetlands or riparian areas at some point in their life cycle or another. So very small amount of land, but very important area-wise, or very important ecologically that way. In terms of bird biodiversity, no surprises here. Tons of shorebirds, tons of other migratory birds that use our wetlands as they move from north to south in the spring and the fall migrations. I'm sure you've all seen thousands of birds like the snow goose festivals that we have out at Beaver Hill Lake. And you've seen those staging birds that just completely land and take over a water body for a week or two in the spring and in the fall. And you'll see lots of those birds moving through. So wetlands are incredibly important. And even our saline wetlands are incredibly important to these, are incredibly important to birds as well. So we used to think that even our salty wetlands weren't that important, but they sure are. And shallow spring wetlands that are only accessible in the spring. Well, if you're a bird and you're flying through an area and there's still 3 feet of ice on Pigeon Lake or Sylvan Lake, but all of the small wetlands are thawed, well, there's a place to get some food. And that can be 2 to 3 weeks before the ice is off those big lakes. So it's incredibly important habitat. So in general, a mix of temporary, seasonal, and permanent wetlands, along with permanent upland habitat, provide the most productive wildlife and waterfowl habitats. So that's really important to remember going through, because we have a policy that really only protects one kind of wetland, almost to the exclusion of the others. So I think something philosophically that is going to change with the new wetland policy that we've got going forward. Of course, I don't need to tell you, lots of species at risk use our wetlands, and as biologists, we're aware of these. So some species at risk that use wetlands, and migratory bird species in particular that use wetlands as well. So whenever we're doing our wetland assessments, we want to be aware of these kind of these wildlife that may be in the area. And of course, this may give a stronger argument for why a wetland should be avoided or not impacted, or how we should better manage the impacts to a particular wetland, say from a construction activity moving forward. Of course, on the fisheries side, a lot of folks aren't aware of this, but wetlands are incredibly important sanctuaries for spawning fish. So fish don't spawn in lakes. Lakes are kind of quiet in terms of biological activity, except for that, that littoral zone around the edge. Fish swim out of the lakes and they go into these shallow wetlands, pike in particular, because they need to lay their eggs on this floating aquatic vegetation that keeps their eggs up off the sediment so they don't suffocate. So a lot of spawning fish come out of the wetlands in the spring, or out of the lakes in the spring and into the shallow wetlands that are associated with those lakes. So they're incredibly important in terms of our fish habitats as well. In terms of plant biodiversity, of course, we've got, especially in our peatlands, but even so in our marshes as well, we've got a variety of plant species that can only live in wetlands. So we've got a lot of water-loving or hydrophilic plants that can only grow in our wetlands. So of our 1,700 vascular plants in Alberta, about 15% of those only grow in wetlands. Lots of rare vascular plants and many non-vascular plants as well. So mosses, liverworts, hornworts only grow in our wetlands. So if you go to places like Lac La Biche, they've got very sensitive orchid fens, for instance, and those are highly valued and highly protected ecosystems as well. And we want to be careful when we're doing development around sensitive fens like that. So what does this all mean? Well, we've lost an awful lot of wetlands in the world, not just in Canada, not just in Alberta, but worldwide. Worldwide, we've lost about half of the wetlands that we had in the last century. It's an incredible amount of area that's been converted, largely due to agriculture, but certainly due to other reasons as well. Of the 25 million kilometers that we had in the 1900s, only about half of that remains. More recent numbers I've seen that we've lost closer to 2/3. I've seen that in the literature as well. Wetlands provide billions of dollars worth of ecosystem services. And again, the science on ecosystem services and wetlands is fairly new, but there's been lots and lots and lots of studies about what is the value of an ecosystem, what is the value of a wetland really worth. So you'll see lots more of that going forward as we move, especially in Alberta, as we move from an area-based approach on dealing with wetlands to a functional benefit, ecological benefit approach. We can start quantifying those, putting a dollar value to it. And I've been on both sides of that debate. Well, we shouldn't be quantifying wetlands. That's no good. They'll never win against the big developments that are worth all the big dollars. But when we start really figuring out the actual values of ecosystem services, I think we're going to find out that they're worth just as much as the brick and mortar services that like a standard wastewater treatment system would provide. How have we lost a lot of our wetlands? I've already hinted at this. Agriculture is our largest culprit, so the largest sort of landscape changes, and that, of course, is no different in Alberta as it is in the rest of Canada. Lots of prairie pothole draining where it's easy to go in the fall, run a ditch through a wetland like that and drain it into the nearest water course that's flowing nearby. And next spring, that all drains out, and you're off to the races. You're starting to farm that. And as we're seeing larger and larger implements on the landscape, more commercial, more industrial size farming operations, 100-foot booms, operators don't want to be going around wetlands and power lines and those sort of things. They want straight lines and GPS navigation and all that good stuff. So we're seeing an awful lot of riparian areas that are being lost and wetlands that are being drained to be able to support that large swaths of seeding and air seeding and that sort of thing. Urban expansion, of course, we've lost a lot of our wetlands in our urban centers. And in some of our urban centers, we've lost more than 90%. City of Edmonton, City of Calgary, we've lost more than 90% of our wetlands in both of those cities. And of course, City of Calgary is struggling with even what to do with the compensation money that they've collected to date. How we're going to spend that. Reservoirs, ports, forestry practices, and of course, to a much lesser extent, peat harvesting. And of course, peat harvesting is a commercial activity that we do along with our forestry activities in the province, and our peat is incredibly valuable, of course, as a horticultural resource. We don't use it to burn as fuel like they do in Europe, but certainly our horticultural peat is a very valuable commodity, and most of it goes by rail car straight to the greenhouses in California. Agricultural impacts, so it's, like I said, it was Canada-wide that we've lost a lot of those wetlands. 65% of our Atlantic tidal and salt marshes, 70% of our Great Lakes marshes and swamps, 71% of our prairie potholes, wetlands. So and the numbers I see in here from Ducks Unlimited oscillate between that 64 to 71%, but the numbers are very high. And of course, that's why Ducks Unlimited spends all the time and money that it does trying to restore class 4 marshes in that prairie pothole region, because it's hunters in Mexico and the States and Canada have all realized that to have ducks, you've got to have habitat. To have habitat, you've got to keep those wetlands on the landscape. So millions of dollars have flowed up from Mexico and from the States to be spent on restoring wetlands, even here in Alberta. And of course, on the industrial side, we've got a massive oil sands footprint or mineable oil sands area. So you get a sense, just when you put it against the size of the province, you get a sense of how big a footprint we're dealing with here. And that's all in peatland in the province. That's all peatland area. So, whoops. That's all peatland area. So, I've talked about wetlands in the south. the mineral wetlands or the prairie pothole wetlands, and this is that white area in this map. We call that the white zone, green zone area of the province, and typically it's the privately held land versus the Crown-owned lands of the province. And largely it fits nicely with the percentage cover of peatlands. So where we've got lots of peatlands, it's typically that boreal forest. You've got 40 centimeters of peat, and you've got a peatland situation, or you've got mineral wetlands in the white zone. So I'm going to talk about peatlands, and I'm going to talk about mineral wetlands. So those are the two very different kinds of wetlands that we have in the province as I move forward here. So one of the jobs that I get asked to do as a consultant is you need to come out. We've got a development application that's going forward, and we've been told by the development officer that you need to identify any water bodies, water courses, water features on the landscape. Of course, the developer always tells us there's no water on our land. We really don't need you to come out, but we have to get you to come out anyway. So as I put on my Quace hat, and off I go. So one of the things I have to do is to delineate a wetland, and I also need to classify it. So there's a couple different classification schemes that I'm going to share with you today that typically you're going to run up against when you're doing wetland assessments. One is the Canadian Wetland Classification System. And this was a classification system that was done by the National Wetlands Working Group at the University of Waterloo back in 1997. And it essentially breaks all of the wetlands that there are in Canada into either organic wetlands, so on the right-hand side, peatlands, versus mineral wetlands on the left-hand side. Of the mineral wetlands, there's shallow open water, there's marshes, and there's swamps. Can anybody tell me what a swamp is? What's a swamp? Swamp's got trees, right? It's easy to remember. Shrek lives in a swamp. Shrek lives in a tree. Treed wetlands or swamp. It's real simple. That's how I remember everything. On the other side, there's organic wetlands or peatlands. There's also swamps. There's also marshes. Of course, everybody in Alberta knows what a marsh is. They commonly call those sloughs. And then there's bogs and fens. So what are bogs and fens? Bogs, of course, is where bog monsters live. Of course, right? What's a bog? Anybody? It's a, sorry? Fed from water from the surface. That's a fen. You got them backwards. That's okay. Right on. So rainwater fed is bogs, so they're very nutrient poor. Rainwater is very low in nutrients. There's no phosphorus in there. There's no ions in there. There's a little bit of DDT from the 60s and 70s, but that's about it. I kid. Fens, of course, are groundwater fed. Groundwater is rich in nutrients and ions, right? So very different biologically systems. With this wetland classification system, they do have their own definitions of what a wetland is. But you'll see that it's pretty close to the Alberta one. Land that is saturated with water long enough to promote wetland or aquatic processes, as indicated by poorly drained soils, hydrophytic vegetation, and various kinds of biological activity adapted to a wet environment. So you've got that water-loving soils, right? Waterlogged soils. You've got water-loving vegetation. And then you've got that biological activity business, or the hydrology piece as well. So those, you got to be good at those three things when you're studying wetlands. So this definition is no big surprise. I've already tipped my hat. Organic wetlands or peatlands have 40 centimeters of peat, and mineral wetlands have little or no organic matter or peat underlaying them. So that's the first thing you'll tell when you pull a soil core. After you've done your one call, right? Ground disturbance people? Yes, that's right. We can't be running around poking a hole 40 centimeters in the ground, can we? So that's always a trick question I ask my juniors. Bogs, you know what a bog is. It's nutrient poor. It's got peat. It's fed only by rainwater. And it's got sphagnum in it. That's the big tell that you're in a bog. It's that sphagnum stuff. You'll also find plants that will only grow in nutrient low, nutrient poor environments. So things like, if we had them here, Venus flytraps, but we have pitcher plants and we have other sundews, other insectivorous plants, because these plants have evolved to get their nutrients from someplace else. And in the cores of these, you'll find sphagnum mosses with tree, shrub, or treeless vegetation cover. Lots of different plants that you'll find around a bog: black spruces, your Labrador tea, or your ericaceous shrubs. The pH of a bog is very low, so you'll find ericaceous or heath plants. In Europe, they call them heath bogs, right? Bog cranberry, and of course your sphagnum species. So soils are fibersols, mesosols, and organic cryosols. And most of our bogs are bogs because of why? Why are they not fed by groundwater? Because they have frozen bottoms. They're covered by permafrost. So you'll find lots of sphagnum in there. Sphagnum is very interesting because it has the ability to acidify its environment. Once it takes over, it will change the pH up to 10,000-fold. So a bog pH runs around 3.3 to 3.8. So I don't even need to go out to the field to do a test to see if it's a bog or not. Just send me a water chemistry sample and I'll just look at the pH and tell you what kind of wetland it is. Lots of different forms and subforms of bogs. This is quite a bit of detail. Of course, we'd never get into this. I just wanted to show you the pretty pictures of different kinds of bogs that we have. The average Albertan would quad right through that, bust a bulldozer right through that, not even know they're in a wetland, not even know they're in a sensitive habitat. And it's only the veg, soils, hydrology people, right, that would recognize that this is a wetland. This is in our new wetland policy, it's something that's going to be protected. In the past, it's not been protected at all. We've not protected our bogs at all. So bogs are suddenly going to be protected in our new wetland policy going forward. So that's exciting. That's exciting news. Switch gears and talk about fens. Fens are a little bit different than bogs. They're a little bit richer. They've got the peat there, though, but these guys are also fed by groundwater. So they've got that nutrient-rich groundwater going there. The big change or the big tell for me that I'm in a fen is I start to see brown mosses in there. Not just peat moss, but brown moss. And brown moss is my tell that I'm in a richer environment. And of course, I'm going to start to see some sedges as well. Sedges are also a big tell that I'm in a richer plant environment. And I'll start to see some graminoids and shrubs characterizing that veg cover as well. Similar plants, but things may change a little bit here. Pitcher plants, you'll see some sedges, Japanocladus, so they're your brown mosses, tamarack trees, glow mosses. But the vegetation around fens is closely related to the depth of the water table and the chemistry of the water's presence. So a fen might only be in contact with groundwater when the permafrost degrades, or 3 months of the year when the ice thaws out, right? So it can be intermittently in contact with that groundwater, and that will control its nutrient cycle. So we've got fens that look an awful lot like bogs because they're very nutrient poor, and then we've got fens that run the gamut all the way up to being very nutrient rich. So you'll hear rich fen, poor fen. You'll hear those terms thrown around, and a poor fen looks an awful lot like a bog, whereas a rich fen looks more like a marsh because they run that gradient. Fens can have this fantastic patterning. So that's a stringed fen on the top right there. And that's something we saw recently in one of the field studies that we were doing. So again, the average Albertan would probably understand they're in a fen because they're very wet. So that's not hard to explain to people. But this is what the average Albertan calls muskeg. So this is the stuff that folks refer to as muskeg. And so, Alberta Serious Environmental Response Team will get a phone call. Someone's phoning in a produced water spill, and the call will come in and be like, okay, what's going on? Oh, we've got a produced water spill up here in Rainbow Lake. Oh, what happened? Well, this pipe broke and got a bunch of produced water. Oh, is there any water bodies nearby? Oh, no, it's just in a big muskeg area. We'll send somebody up right away. That's typically how that story goes. Swamps. Swamps are treed wetlands. Remember, Shrek lives in a tree. Swamps are treed wetlands, so they've got the peat. They're also mineralogenous, so they've also got groundwater and rainwater feeding them, so they're richer. And depending on how hydrologically connected they are to the groundwater and how much nutrients there are there, they can look and have all sorts of different kinds of vegetation cover. But swamps do swing both ways, so you'll find swamps on mineral soils and you'll find swamps on organic soils. So if you've got more than 25% of cover of your wetland is treed, you're a swamp. That's just how that works. Marshes. Marshes, switching gears a little bit, marshes are only found on mineral soils, so it's either less than 40 centimeters peat or no peat at all. They have shallow surface water, which fluctuates dramatically. They're mineralogenous as well. They have a little accumulation of that organic matter, and there's all sorts of plant life that's found there. So you've got aquatic macrophytes like rushes, reeds, grasses, and sedges, and some floating macrophytes as well. And we realize that just by the concentric nature, the concentric ring nature of marshes, as we see these rings of different plant communities, starting with the trees, and then grasses, and then sedges, and then in the middle you've got your emergent, your deep marsh plants, and then in the very middle you've got the shallow marsh plants. So you can almost walk, the rings of a wetland and look at these gradients, and this is how we delineate them. We take advantage of that. This is most dramatic or most pronounced in the fall. If you look at one of these marshes in the fall, and you'll see all the vegetation has died back, and they're all different shades of brown. So that's one way of telling these different wetlands apart. And of course, this is a botanist's wild dream, going and classifying a marsh, because you've got every kind of vegetation you can possibly think about. Grasses and sedges and duckweeds and arrowheads and emergent vegetation and submergent vegetation and your bulrushes or your cattails or those sort of things. So emergent aquatic macrophytes, graminoids, shrubs, and then other herbaceous species such as broad-leaved emergent macrophytes, floating-leaved and submergent species, even liverworts and algae. So you could be out there all day assessing a marsh in terms of all the vegetation that you'll see in them. They're quite dynamic. And like I said, they're arranged in these very concentric rings. Starting out with in the middle, you've got that open pool with aquatic plants, then you've got some emergent veg, next you're at the sedges and the reeds, then you're with the low rushes and sedges at your herb meadow, and then finally the trees at your extreme edge. So, and that pattern of vegetation changes with drawdowns in the wetland. And so that's where we really struggle looking at these kind of wetlands, because these wetlands can go completely dry in some years. And just because you went out there in August one year and it was all completely dry, well, there's no wetland here. We can't make that assessment. We've got to look at the hydrograph. We've got to look at the hydrograph for the wetland. We've got to look at how wet it's been that year, the Canadian climate normals, and we've got to look at how wet that area has been in the last 10 years. And then I would look at the photo record back to the 1940s to see what has this wetland ordinarily looked like over the whole last 100 years even, if it exists. And then finally, there's the shallow water wetlands class. So wet water that's less than 2 meters deep in midsummer, occupies more than 75% of the surface area in the confined basin, and it may also occupy the bays and margins of profundal zones of the lake. So you can cleave out that less than 2 meter deep parts of the lake and call that a shallow open water wetland. And of course, the emergent vegetation and submerged vegetation you'll find there is water milfoil, potamogetons or pondweeds, and then pond lilies and all sorts of plants like that. So lots of different plants in the shallow water class. And of course, the classification system further breaks these down and gives them modifiers. So restrictions and disadvantages of using the Canadian wetland classification system in Alberta. Well, it's really great in the north. It's really great in the boreal. It's really great in the green zone, but it's not as good in the white zone. So where you want to have the resolution around marshes, I would really recommend you use Stewart-Kantrud. So I'll introduce Stewart-Kantrud in a second. But it also is very complex, and it can exceed the needs of the average user. And you can just imagine me talking to a developer and saying, well, sir, you've got a polygonal peat plateau bog with surface with network of polygonal fissures, and it's perennially frozen, and talking like that, and you'll quickly lose your audience. So we need something a little simpler for folks. I have introduced where our peatlands are. One of the ecological goods and services that I've not introduced is how amazingly effective these are at storing carbon. And in Alberta, we make a big fuss about how much carbon is stored in our trees. There's way more carbon locked away in our peatlands than there is in any of the above ground biomass. I'll bet that any day of the week. If you've got more than a meter or so of peat, I will guarantee you've got more carbon locked away than in all of the above ground biomass. And it doesn't burn or die every 80 or 100 years. This stuff's locked away for thousands of years. So this is our carbon sink in Canada. And you get a sense of how much carbon is locked away in Canadian peatlands all the way across this fantastic country of ours. Switch gears a little bit, because I'm kind of morbid this way. Bog bodies. Anybody know what a bog body is? One of the things I learned in my undergraduate is that bogs are not a good place to get rid of a body. It turns out they're preserved for thousands of years. Why? Because of that high pH I was telling you about. or low pH, low oxygen, tends to preserve tissue and bone for thousands of years. So we've got, you can actually see the faces on some of the sacrificial victims that were killed, 2,000 years ago. And there was actually a bog body display that went through the University of Calgary a couple of years ago. One of the folks that took my course told me all about it. It was really exciting. So in Europe, most bog bodies are associated with the Iron Age, and a lot of these died as a part of sacrificial rituals. But the acidity, aerobic conditions, and low temperatures can preserve skin and internal organs. Real fantastic, really interesting. So next time you're bored at work, just Google bog bodies. I'll tell you, it'll keep you busy all afternoon. It's really fun. So the Stewart-Kantrud classification system, now I've told you that it's really good for the southern part of the province. So this is the prairie pothole region itself, and you can see where it picks up a good chunk of Alberta, some of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, into the Dakotas, Minnesota, and even on down into Iowa. And we've recognized this, and it's a series of chunks of glacier that broke off and formed these little depressions in the landscape and thawed out and formed these myriad of pothole wetlands all through this area. And it's incredible duck habitat, fantastic duck habitat. And this is why Ducks Unlimited spends millions of dollars restoring wetlands in this area that have been drained, because this is also fantastic ag land. It's also fantastic cropland, right? But Harold Kantrud and Stewart put together this classification system in 1971 called Classification of Natural Ponds and Lakes in the Glaciated Prairie Region from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it describes how to classify these wetlands. And basically, it borrows from that thinking of the concentric ring around these wetlands. So it borrows from that thinking. And so we're distinguishing the vegetation zone occurring in the central or deepest part of our wetland and occupying 5% or more of the total wetland that's being classified. So we go right to the middle, we look at the middle and we say, what's this area? And we classify that first, and then we work our way outwards. We also know that because we live in a dry climate, these wetlands shift from one class to another. And it kind of looks like this. You've got class 1 ephemeral ponds that have a low prairie zone of vegetation. You've got class 2 temporary ponds that have a wet meadow zone in the middle with the low prairie zone on the outside. You've got class 3s, seasonal pond or lakes with a shallow marsh zone surrounded by the wet meadow zone, surrounded by the low prairie zone. It's almost like a children's song, isn't it? The knee bone is connected to the, no? Nobody? No. So class 4, semi-permanent pond or lake, deep marsh zone, surrounded by shallow marsh zone, surrounded by wet meadow zone, surrounded by low prairie zone. And then finally class 5, a lake. And of course, we're not too fussy in Alberta with what we call lakes, right? I worked on Frank Lake, and the big joke there was, my supervisor told me, Suzanne Bailey told me, if you're ever worried about drowning in Frank Lake, Jay, just stand up. It's about that deep. We did manage to find a bore a hole and sink a boat one afternoon, though, so I still wear that badge of honor. Class 5 permanent ponds or lakes has that permanent open water zone surrounded by the deep marsh zone, surrounded by the shallow marsh zone, surrounded by the wet meadow zone, surrounded by the low prairie zone. So these 5 types of wetlands, you get out, you assess the vegetation, and they're very fairly straightforward to identify. But like I said, in a dry year, this guy might shift to looking more like that one. And in a wet year, this guy might shift to looking more like that one. Or if, say, somebody improperly installed a culvert, this one might start looking like that one, right? Because you're getting more water onto the site than you should have been receiving. And that's the hydrological component you've got to look at. Are there any modifications to roads nearby? Have there been any changes to runoff in the landscape? Did the farmer do something upstream that's changed how water flows across the landscape? And these are all things that we need to think about. Finally, there's class 6 wetlands. Class 6 marshes, or class 6 alkali pond or lake. That picture was taken in July. That's not snow. That's a 30-degree day. That's the alkali. That's the salt ring around this wetland. And there's plants that are very unique to that. And these are obviously very easy wetlands to identify. Also very attractive wetlands for shorebirds. And then finally, class 7 fen ponds. And those are a whole lot more difficult wetlands to identify. And they're not fens like the fens that we were just talking about, the 40 centimeters of peat and all the different plants fens. This is a different kind of fen under the Stewart-Kantrud. And it causes a lot of people a lot of grief because people get the two confused. And they're using the word fen, but they're not meaning the same thing. So everyone can easily see the Class 1 wetland here, right? And this is a real life example of things that we deal with all the time. So an ephemeral wetland is a wetland that's probably only going to be wet for a few days to a few weeks in the springtime. And that's about it, and it's going to dry up. And there's a lot of reasons why it's going to disappear. It's got a leaky bottom. It's very well hydrologically connected to groundwater, so it's going to recharge groundwater. And if it's modified in any way, or disked through or plowed through, it can shed its water even faster, even been ditched through. But this is a low prairie zone for that style of wetland. This kind of wetland often is not protected in Alberta, even though it's part of a drainage way or does recharge groundwater or does serve a whole host of ecological goods and services. We typically don't protect these in Alberta. Here's the kind of plants that you may see in a wetland like that. Again, are we seeing water-loving plants here? Well, if you look hard and squint, not really. These aren't really water-loving plants. And that's one of the reasons why folks don't really look at these as wetlands. Class 2 wetlands or temporary wetlands. Everybody can easily see the Class 2 wetland here, right? No one would ever disturb something like that. Well, these are protected. These are protected wetlands. And this is a real example from an agricultural setting. And it's got the grasses and sedges that I'm looking for in a Class 2 wetland, or that wet meadow zone surrounded by a low prairie zone. And it's dry. This is the dry phase. And this is a wetland that's probably only going to be wet for a matter of weeks in the spring. In a wet, or during a heavy rainfall in a wet year. So these aren't often expressing themselves as wetlands. And Class 2's common vegetation that we'll see here, if there's any botanists in the crowd, you'll notice that there's some sedges and specific grasses that are water-loving vegetation. So this does pass that test of, yeah, this is water-loving vegetation in this wetland. So typically under the Water Act, we do compensate for losses of Class 2 wetlands and above. So this is a protected wetland. Class 3 wetlands, seasonal ponds and lakes. And of course now we are seeing that open water. Is this going to be wet in August? Absolutely. This is a picture that was taken in August. So these wetlands typically have got water in them that persists for several months, maybe even year-round in a wetter year. But they could dry out in a wet year, but they'll often have water in them until August or September. And water-loving vegetation there for sure. But also, this wetland may be impacted by roads or culverts nearby too. So that's something I'm going to have to investigate. Where does the low prairie zone end in this example? That green arrow back there. Anybody have any ideas? That's right, because it's impossible to tell. This is a wetland that's been impacted by agriculture, so the exact edge of that has been infringed upon by agriculture. So you'll find that in a lot of the wetlands that I deal with, or that you deal with out on the landscape, they're farmed right up into that wet meadow zone quite often. It's when they get into the shallow marsh zone they start getting stuck. Common plants you'll see in a Class 3 wetland, and again, some real water-loving plants here for sure. I mean, you're in a low area or a low wet area because these are plants that do not exist on a hill. Slough grasses and reed canary grasses and ragworts and docks and burreeds. Finally, Class 4s, semi-permanent ponds and lakes. This is what the average Albertan would call a slough. This is what the average Albertan starts to think of when they start thinking of a wetland. Well, this is, but even these aren't that well protected on the landscape, and we've lost an amazing number of Class 4 wetlands on our landscape. But they've got that deep marsh zone, they've got the shallow marsh zone, the wet meadow zone, and the low prairie zone. And the big tells that you're in a Class 4 wetland is cattails. Cattails and bulrushes are the big, oh, hey, this is obvious that I'm in a Class 4 type Stewart-Kantrud marsh. And that's what the junior biologists tend to gravitate towards and really look at. So bulrushes, duckweeds, cattails, those sort of plants we're looking for in a Class 4 wetland. Finally, Class 5, permanent ponds and lakes. This is my Frank Lake example. And you've got all sorts of plants that you had from all the previous examples, plus we've got submerged aquatics as well. And again, this can be any depth as well, whereas in the previous classification system, it maxed out at 2 meters, whereas Stewart-Kantrud is not as fussy. So all lakes are wetlands under Stewart-Kantrud, which is pretty neat. Class 6 alkali ponds and lakes. Again, these are east of the city here in Edmonton. Out towards the St. Paul area, you'll find lots of very rich groundwater upwells that feed these wetlands. And they can have incredibly high conductivities, up in the thousands to up in the hundreds of thousands of TDS. And you'll see that anything over double of that of seawater, you start to get that white crust on the shoreline. So anything twice that of seawater, you get that white crusting that you'll see on these wetlands. And these are incredibly important wetlands for certain shorebirds. Common vegetation there, obviously plants that love a saline environment and a very high pH. So there's very specific plants that you'll find growing there. And I've noticed too that a lot of mining operations have borrowed these kind of plants for reclamation because it's such a high salt content and they want to use this kind of plant for the reclamation seeding material. Finally, class 7 fen ponds. Again, this is another wetland example that the average Albertan would drive a cat through or a truck through or a quad through and not even know that they're in a sensitive wetland. And it's going to be your botanist, it's going to be your hydrologist, it's going to be your soils people that point out, hey, this is a class 7 fen pond. Fen ponds, the big tell that you're in a fen pond is a pervasiveness of water sedges. And I've had students out in the field before where there's just this acres of water sedge. And I've asked them what class of wetland it is, and they're running around, look at all the little yellow plants and all the little other plants, and I quite literally couldn't see the forest for the trees. Water sedge is the big tell that you're in a class 7 type of wetland as well. These wetlands typically aren't protected either, so it's 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s that are often protected under the Water Act, and 6s and 7s regulators often don't know what to do with. Restrictions and disadvantages of Stewart-Kantrud. Obviously, we're only going to use that in the south. It's not meant for bogs and fens or peatlands, so its utility is just that in the south. So who assesses wetlands? I've already introduced myself as being a QASE. Well, what the heck is this QASE person all about anyway? Well, that's a Qualified Wetland Aquatic Environment Specialist. This is a term that the department dreamed up when they came up with the compensation guide in 2005. QASE is an expert with detailed knowledge of the aquatic environment, wetland soils, wetland species, wetland hydrology, and wetland margin habitat and their management or assessment. So like I said, you needed to be good at all those 3 things to be good at doing the wetlands work. And the terminology from that was sort of borrowed from another regulatory document that was in support of the Water Act. Going to switch gears and talk about riparian areas a little bit. First of all, what is a riparian area? Everyone's heard the term riparian lately. What does it mean? What's a riparian area? Well, it dawned on me recently that riparian areas are quite simply wetlands. And we go through all these great pains to give us this riparian area definition, but riparian areas are just the transition between upland and wetland. And really, they're the edge of our wetlands. And really, if you take that one step further, I think they're our highest value wetlands. So they're a very special kind of wetland, riparian areas are. And they're very, very valuable, typically alongside of our water bodies. They're that wet fringe, and they are our highest value wetland. And that's one of the things I'm pushing as our new wetland policy goes forward, is the protection of these unique riparian wetlands, because they're the highest value wetlands, I think, that we have. And if you look at the definition of what a riparian area is, well, it's water-loving plants, it's the soils piece, it's that different vegetation than the adjacent area. So it's very simple to me that this is just the edge of our wetland. Species similar to or adjacent to, or similar to adjacent areas, but exhibiting more vigorous or robust growth forms. So yeah, you go to the upland area and the grass is up to your knees. You step down a little ways into the wetland and the grass is be this tall, this tall. Why is that? Well, because it's wetter there. Why is that? Because it's a wetland. So it's very, very, very simple stuff to see. Where do you find these riparian areas? Everywhere. Lakes, streams, rivers, swamps, marshes, bogs, fens, and estuaries. And the Cowardin classification system, which I've not introduced today, even talks about riverine wetlands. And of course, that's what they're trying to pick up with the riparian area, different terms. So with our new wetland policy, we could be dealing with all of our riparian areas all at the same time. So there's an opportunity here moving forward. And again, riparian zones characterized by water-loving and upland vegetation. The identification of your plants helps you to identify where the edge of your riparian area is. I get that question every day, where does the riparian zone end? And it has to do with where the soils are and where the plants are, and those are your indicators of where your riparian zone is. Just like our wetlands, we've lost an awful lot of our wetlands. There's some cows and fish data. In the early 19th century, 70% of our riparian areas were healthy. Nowadays, 11% of our riparian areas are healthy. It's completely flipped. 50% of them are healthy or with problems. 40% are completely unhealthy. So as we continue to do state of the watershed reports for each of the major basins in our province, that message continues to come out. And this message links right back to the loss of our wetlands, because these riparian areas are our highest value wetlands. We're moving towards a wetlands functions and benefits approach to managing our wetlands with our new policy, and I'm going to get into that shortly. And I wanted to introduce some of the ecosystem services that wetlands provide. And this is from Ramsar. The Alberta government has taken a different look at wetlands. I'll go through what they're indicating as important, but from a broader scale, there's a whole bunch of different services that wetlands support. I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about legislation and laws that as a consultant I'm going to run into day-to-day, in my day-to-day work. When I'm looking at projects, when I'm dealing with projects, the number one thing I'm going to look at is Fisheries Act. We've already mentioned that wetlands are incredibly important fish habitat. So if your wetland is having any impacts on it, the Fisheries Act may apply to it. And it deals with the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. And really they're looking for the input of sediment into a wetland. So if there's going to be extreme sediment going into a water course, the Fisheries Act will apply. And the Fisheries Act has undergone some incredible changes in the last couple of years as well. So we're now just dealing with fish of a recreational, aboriginal, or commercial fisheries that are being managed now. So a lot of the rules around DFO have changed with our project, so you need to stay on top of that legislation. Bill C-38 changed a lot of the HAD provisions under that Fisheries Act, so now we're just dealing with serious types of activities, and that HAD provisions being changed to serious harm to fish. So there's lots of things that you can do to give serious harm to fish but not kill it. So you could wipe out its breeding, but you're not killing the fish. So there's some real interesting looks at this new federal legislation. So there's many serious harms to fish that are less than death but threaten its survival. So we're looking for that permanent alteration of habitat when we're reviewing a project. And when in doubt, file it with DFO, and they'll give you their feedback on whether or not you're going to require approval for destruction of fish habitat. There's also the Migratory Birds Convention Act. Migratory birds is a huge component when dealing with wetlands, because you've got wetlands, a lot of wetland species, a lot of wetland bird species, and a lot of these can be impacted by impacts in the spring when birds are nesting, and that's when they're the most sensitive. So there's a lot of impacts to wetland birds that have to be restricted until August when the birds have fledged, or often into September. So if there's a wetland, there's a longer restricted activity period for activities. All sorts of industrial activity affects migratory birds and bird habitat. So there's the building of roads, clearing of trees, excavation for pipelines, even noises, lights, all sorts of things like that can affect these birds. So in some cases, We will buffer off an area by 100 meters around a roadway while they build a road or while they build a bridge or do activities like that. And we need to make sure that we minimize the impact of these birds until they've had a chance to fledge, often in July or into August. The rules for migratory birds have also changed recently as well. So there's some, I gave a talk at the Alberta Heavy Road Builders Association, and there's, in some cases when you're building birds and the birds continue to build nests on that bridge, you need to do daily maintenance to keep the birds from building nests on the bridge so that you're not destroying eggs. So you want to prevent them from getting to the egg stage. Provincial legislation. There's the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, which supports and promotes the protection, enhancement, and wise use of the environment. And this covers a wide range of activities that are related to wetlands. So most of the time people would say, what's a PIA have to do with wetlands, Jay? Well, there's lots of different things. You've got wastewater and storm drainage. And what I said earlier about the produced water spill, you've got a lot of substance release issues around wetlands. So there are produced water spills, there's oil spills in wetlands going on in Alberta on a daily basis. So I've done a lot of cross-training with Alberta's Serious Environmental Response Team folks, and there's, like I say, there's spills that go on every day. So it's really important to know what kind of wetland you're dealing with, what kind of wetland you're in, and what kind of impacts you're going to have on that wetland. And then finally the big one, and that's the Water Act. And the Water Act dictates all sorts of impacts to water and, of course, water bodies, and the draining or infilling of wetlands on private or public land. So it is against the law to drain or infill a wetland on private or public land. So when I deal with the average landowner, they're absolutely shocked to learn that they do not own the water that's on their land, and in some cases they don't own the land that's under the water that's on their land. And so that's often an eye-opening thing. So if folks have impacted a wetland or drained a wetland, then there can be some enforcement that follows from that. Public Lands Act is another piece of legislation that dictates how wetlands are impacted. And underneath the Public Lands Act, the beds and shores of all permanent naturally occurring bodies of water is owned by the Crown. So wetlands are the complete acid test of water permanence in this province. So, you know, everybody knows that Sylvan Lake is not theirs. But what most people don't know is that that wetland over in the corner of their property also not theirs. And just because there's no mention of it on your title doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So a lot of folks are really shocked to learn that. And so they've drained a wetland or they've impacted a wetland in some way. That's against the law, it's against the Water Act, it's against the Public Lands Act. So there could be prosecutions based on that. So yeah, just to reiterate that, the Crown owns the beds and shores of all permanent and naturally occurring bodies of water in the white area and all of the land in the green area, including its wetlands. So the Public Lands Act does differentiate wetlands in the white and in the green zone. And the Public Lands Act prohibits the disturbance of any public land in any manner that results or is likely to result in injury to the bed and shore of any river, stream, watercourse, lake, or other body of water or land in the vicinity of that public land. So if you've got a cabin out on Pigeon Lake, you can't just go out and modify the shoreline because that's part of the public land of the bed and shore of the lake that you're right beside there. So there's all sorts of interesting cases of sand dumping and shoreline alterations and all those sort of things which are an offense under the Public Lands Act. I've already introduced the white zone and the green zone areas, and obviously that just puts more of a point on it. And again, we've got a brand new land use framework in the province, which is helping us deal with wetlands on a much higher level scale. The Surveys Act, surveyors are actually the folks that determine where the edges of the wetlands are. That's their job as a surveyor. Of course, the direction they have is that they need to identify where the shore of the body is, and it's the piece of land that's covered so long by water as to wrest it from vegetation, or as to mark a distinct character on the vegetation where it extends into the water or onto the soil itself. So surveyors determine the edge of your wetland. Well, the biologists will know that, well, actually it's the plant life. It's the water-loving plants and the soils that determine where that edge is. So if we've got a very complicated compensation file, then I will often send out a botanist with the surveyor to help us identify the edge of that water body. There's lots of great examples. Well, not great examples, but there's lots of examples throughout, if you read the newspaper, you read Alberta government files about folks who have been charged with all sorts of infractions for doing wetlands work without an approval. So if you destroy a wetland or modify a wetland, drain a wetland, there's charges can be laid. And not just charges to companies, but actually to specific people within the company as well. So I hear this all the time, well, farmers get away with all of it. No, the oil and gas guys get away with all of it. And it's not really the case. So there's a particular instance, a certain land developer was charged for commencing and continuing an activity without a proper approval. So draining a wetland, doing some land leveling work. And of course, Ducks Unlimited got some creative sentencing funds to put towards a wetland restoration project as part of that. But they actually went after a director of this company as well. So as professionals, we all need to be aware of what our role is to make sure we keep our clients out of hot water. I've already talked a little bit about the Alberta Energy Regulator. They took over responsibilities from AESRD a while ago. They're dealing with all aspects of upstream oil and gas, oil sands, and coal. And that's the Water Act file, the Public Land Act file, all of those files. So that's they call it the single regulator, which is a bit of a euphemism. Of course, it's not a single regulator. It's a single regulator for one industry. But for the rest of us in the water world, it's another regulator that we have to deal with and understand the regulations of. So as a professional, we need to understand all those things. So what does Alberta's new 2013 wetland policy say? This is what I'm sure you all came here for. This is the exciting part of the presentation. I wanted to get all of us to a common understanding of where we are all at. With wetlands, we all know what a bog and a fen and a swamp are now. We all know that it's illegal to drain a wetland. We all know that you need to be a quace to do wetlands work. We need to know that there's more to Alberta than just muskegs and sloughs, right? You're on board with me there? Good. So what does our new wetland policy say? Well, we're getting rid of that area-based approach of managing our wetlands. We've got a policy goal now to conserve, restore, protect, and manage wetlands to sustain the benefits they provide to the environment, society, and the economy. And you'll find that everything the Alberta government does these days, we always talk about that triple bottom line. We always talk about the environment, society, and the economy. Those three pieces we're always dealing with. So wetlands of the highest value are protected for the long term. So we need to identify what are the highest value wetlands, and those are the ones we want to protect the most. We want to protect wetlands with their benefits in areas where losses have been high. So you can imagine it's the southern region where we've lost a lot of our prairie pothole wetlands. And we want to continue to avoid, minimize, and then instead of compensate, now we're replacing lost wetland value. So before we used to compensate on an area for area basis. Well, you took out 3 acres of wetland, you got to put in 3 or more acres of wetland over here. Well, now we're talking about replacing lost value. So we need to be able to figure out what is the value that we've lost. And we're going to manage our wetlands in a regional context. Well, I just showed you that land use framework map. Each of those land use areas, we can manage wetlands in a different way in each of those areas based on how much losses we've had in the past. The policy now includes all wetlands in Alberta, bogs, fens, swamps, marshes, and shallow open water. So before, we were only looking at those prairie pothole wetlands. Those were the only things that we protected at a very high level, and the permanent ones, whereas now we're looking after all of our wetlands and all restored natural wetlands and wetlands that have been constructed for the purpose of wetland replacement. You should also be aware that there's going to be a new classification system. So there's a draft version of a new classification system that is being floated around right now. And I believe the Society of Professional Biologists just had a chance to comment on that back in October. So we'll probably see that coming live shortly as well. Some different strategic directions encouraging flexible wetland management and a whole bunch of other tools in the toolkit here. The key concepts are going to be around wetland value. Value, 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 value. All of us, when we leave the room today, need to be able to talk about wetland values. That's going to be the key point in all of this going forward, and that's probably one of our biggest shortcomings right now. Our mitigation scheme still focuses on avoidance. It still focuses on minimization, but the third step changes. So instead of compensation, running to Ducks Unlimited with a check, it's replacing lost value. There's going to be a focus with knowledge and information systems, Performance measures, monitoring, so we've got that brand new Amera that's just been set up. And wetland stewardship, and I don't think that's been sorted around yet, but I'm looking forward to seeing where we're going with wetland stewardship. So this is all based around relative wetland value. How do we figure that out? Well, we know that some wetlands provide more functions and benefits than others. Some wetlands are really good bird habitat. Some wetlands are not. Some wetlands are really good for flood and storage control. Some are not. So wetlands will be compared across a list of metrics that are derived from 5 functional groups. These are the functional groups: biodiversity and ecological health. Well, we know that prairie pothole wetlands are far better than, say, bogs for bird habitat or other biodiversity means. Not to say that bogs aren't important. We'll look at water quality improvement, we'll look at hydrological function, we'll look at human use, and then finally we look at relative abundance. Now, relative abundance, you've already heard from me a couple of times that we're good Canadians and we tend to squander things that we have lots of, or we think that we have lots of. We think we have lots of water. We're the biggest water wasters in the world. We think we have lots of wetlands, so we've trashed a lot of our wetlands. Well, this functional group's predicated on abundance again, and we're going to downgrade our wetlands if there's lots of them. I struggle with that philosophy. And this is how it looks. You've got biodiversity plus water quality improvement plus hydrologic function plus human value multiplied by some multiplier of abundance, and if there's lots of you, you're going to get scaled down, equals some sort of value category, and we've got a high, a moderate, a moderately low, and a low category. What does that mean for developers or consultants? Well, it means that if you're going to take out a high-value wetland, you will need to replace it with a high-value wetland on a one-to-one basis. If you're going to take out a low-value wetland, you need to replace it with a low-value wetland on a one-to-one basis. And it kind of scales 8-to-1, 4-to-1, 2-to-1, 1-to-1 if you're replacing one with the other. So if you're taking out a high, you need to replace it with an 8 amounts of low. So it goes 8-to-1 down to 1-to-1, and then 1-to-1 over to 1/8 to 1, 1 over 8 for compensation. So that's all sort of symmetrical, I guess, if you look at it. So replacement ratios can be as high as 8-to-1 or as low as 0.125 to 1. That's 1/8 to 1. So the mitigation scheme, focusing on the avoid, then the minimize, and then, of course, replacing lost value as a last resort where we couldn't avoid or where we couldn't minimize. And, of course, there's lots of reasons why we can't do that. The strongest voices for why we couldn't avoid a wetland impact, we had to take it out, is if we were in controlled airspace. You certainly wouldn't want to have large avian macrofauna interacting with helicopters or jet planes coming in for a landing, right? So for air safety, you don't want to have big birds in an area. So when we're dealing with wetlands that are in flyways like that, often we're asked, maybe we could put a replacement wetland someplace different. Avoidance needs to be the primary consideration. Wetlands of higher value are going to require a higher evidence standard than those that are of lower value. And if avoidance is not deemed practical, evidence of alternative plans needs to be presented. And that's always important as well. So I need to work with a regulator to show why my proponent couldn't avoid. Was it an economic reason? Was it a social reason? Was it a safety reason? Like the airport example. 2 types of replacement we're going to have is restorative and non-restorative. Well, that's pretty easy to think about. Restorative replacement, we're going to actually build wetlands on our site, or we're going to do some other non-restorative. So restorative replacement, we're going to build our own wetland on site to make up for the permanent loss of wetlands through either a restoration, an enhancement, or we're actually going to construct a brand new wetland. And construction of a new wetland is now allowed under this policy. We were not able to do that prior. So, all of you can actually start digging holes in your backyard and building a constructed wetland and getting compensated for it. Just saying. Non-restorative replacement does not require the replacement of a wetland, but is instead geared towards advancing wetland science. So research, monitoring, wetland inventory, or landscape watershed health is all fair game now. We'll see a lot of this being rolled out in June when the new tools are coming available. There's also the in-lieu fee payment. Certainly we can still go the old route where we pay Ducks Unlimited to allow them to recreate a wetland for us, so that's still going to happen. There's also the permittee responsible replacement, where the permittee, the approval holder themselves, does some restoration. Maybe not on their own site, maybe on a site nearby that they also own. So in the city of Calgary, where the land value is so much, that's a very attractive approach. So what about policy implementation? Well, it's yet to be determined. And we've been told that June 2015 is when the white zone implementation phase is going to come into play. And for the green zone, it'll be the summer of 2016. It will not apply to applications that are already in the queue. And that's just the way it is. Some of the criticisms of this new policy, well, we've removed no net loss. We had a no net loss policy for wetlands in this province up until this policy came in 2013. So a lot of folks were really upset about that. There's little consideration for differences between wetlands in the white zone and in the green zone. We're going to try and cover them all with one functional tool. That's going to be problematic. And there are some functional tools that are out there, but the ones that I've seen, or the ones that the province has piloted, are not set up to be effective for peatlands. So we've got a tool that's pretty effective for prairie pothole wetlands, like a WESPAS, like a Wetland Ecosystem Services Protocol tool, but not one for peatlands. So we're really struggling with that one. One of the other criticisms of the wetland policy is that, like I said, a lot of these large approvals, large oil sands development projects are exempt. So there's 195 plus projects that are going to go through, and this new policy will not apply to them. There's also no science-based justification that more abundant wetlands may be impacted without decreasing their value. So just because there's lots of peatlands doesn't mean we can go about losing them without losing a whole bunch of value. Must avoid unless it's deemed not practical. Who determines not practical? The current policy does not allow for an increase in wetland area in the province, nor does it address past losses. So this wetland policy starts us off at zero, not at the fact that we're already minus 70% of our prairie pothole wetlands. So that's an issue. The policy also leaves the department with little meaningful mechanisms to say no to developments that occur on sensitive or even high value wetlands. So that's always an issue for the approval writers as well. And that's one of the things we always hear on the other side is, well, we don't have the ability to say no. So I struggle with that. Wetland compensation in Alberta, Ducks Limited is our largest wetland restoration agency. Millions of dollars goes to Ducks to do wetland restoration work. I've already talked about the great work that they've done throughout Alberta. Largely, they're focusing on that prairie pothole region, though. There are some other WRAs, or wetland restoration agencies in the province, and we know that the program needs to be expanded. So that's one of the things the new wetland policy is going to work towards, is expanding this. But we're also moving out of this fee-for-service based approach where you pay them and then they go build a wetland, and into an American-style banking approach. So banking is the creation, restoration, or enhancement of wetlands that will be sold or exchanged to compensate for future losses. So I wasn't crazy when I said you could start digging that wetland in your backyard, because you've got to get digging it now, and you've got to get the plants growing, because later you can sell credits towards it. And that's how this works. It works kind of backwards. The wetland already has to be in place before you can bank it and then sell the credits that you say it cost to build the wetland. So very common in the States. Wetland banking is hugely popular in the States, but not in Canada. So that's the way I think we're moving towards with this new policy. We'll still do some of that in lieu fee business, but we're moving towards a banking approach. So you'll see that in the coming years as well. I mean, this is going to take a long time to get established. So what about peatlands? The destruction of peatlands in the green zone is common in the face of oil and gas exploration, and they're incredibly difficult wetlands to recreate. It takes thousands of years to grow a peatland. So how do we do that? Creating a marsh is much easier to do, so we've often been doing that. We'll just have end-pit lakes, or we'll recreate another kind of wetland. So it throws that like-for-like concept out the window, because the functions and the ecology of peatlands are very different from that of marshes. So we've really struggled with that. Our reclamation professionals have really struggled with that over the years, and that's something that needs to be addressed under the new policy as well. I've talked about ecosystem services, and now there's tools for measuring these ecosystem services. The province has piloted this Wetland Ecosystem Services Protocol from the United States, or WESPAS, and have trialed it out in southern Alberta and said it could be used in our new wetland policy. So this is potentially a tool that the province could be using moving forward. Developers and planning officers from municipalities constantly are asking, what are the components of a good wetland assessment? What are the things that you need to see? Well, like I said, you can't just walk out there that day, look at the plants, look at the soils, write up a report and send it in. It's not that easy. We need to look at that historical air photo piece. So I need to look at 40 years, 100 years back, 50 years back, whatever, of whatever the historical air photos are for that site. And then I need to look at climate normals. And I need to see a variety of seasons, so not just May, June, July, August. I want to look at a variety of seasons, and I can start to put together an idea of what type of wetland this is. I need to look at historical climate records. Then we go out and classify and delineate. We look at the veg, we look at wildlife, we look at hydrology, we look at other wildlife biophysical things, nesting, staging, habitat areas. We might want to do some water quality work. You might want to do some algae or zooplankton work. So those are all some of the components, and it depends how large a scale that you're working at here. Following this piece, you would do an assessment, so based on an impact assessment. So based on the activity that's being proposed for that site, you would say, here's what we think is going to be the impact assessment for this site. So you got to go out on site to properly classify a wetland. This is not a desktop approach. This also isn't something that can be done in January in Alberta, under 3 feet of snow. And we'll have clients that say, oh no, you got to go out, you got to do this wetland assessment. No, we're not going out in January to do a wetland assessment. It's pretty much impossible. You're not going to find anything. So we got to do this, largely in May to September. This is a very May to September, very seasonal business that we're in here. So you can only go out when plants are flowering and when you can actually see what's going on. And of course, if you go out in May, it might be really wet. If you go out in August, it might be really, really dry. So you've got to kind of pay attention to that too while you're out there. Yeah, lots of different plants that you'll see. Shells, evidence of that this site may have been wetter, or maybe this site may have been drier, depending on what you see out there. And impoundments, roads, bridges, culverts, all sorts of changes to hydrological flow, all those sort of things. Some great studies that have been done, where is avoidance in the implementation of wetland law and policy. So there's some really great folks from Pembina Institute and some grad students at the U of A that have talked about, criticized the provincial wetland policy. So we'll see if some of their criticisms have gone into the new policy or how that's all going to go. Because right now we're still waiting on the implementation piece. We still want to know how this policy is going to be implemented. So that's the toughest part. And I'm hoping that by June we'll have all those tools in place. So why do we miss the boat on avoidance? Well, there's lots of reasons why avoidance doesn't happen. There's lots of times that folks don't know what is avoidance. Land use plans don't identify high-value wetlands before the development process begins, and that's an issue. Wetlands are economically undervalued, of course. We have overconfidence in our restoration techniques, and our compensation requirements often are inadequately enforced. So that was one of the findings of that paper as well. So to summarize, our wetlands are largely in the northern hemisphere. Canada and Russia have as the largest aerial wetland expanses. 17% of Alberta's landscape covered in wetlands. Lots of different classes of wetlands depending on which classification system that you use. But really there's the 5 big ones, and that's the 5 big ones that we're going to be looking at going forward. Bogs, fen, marshes, swamps, shallow open water. Wetlands perform a myriad of functions ranging from improving water quality, mitigating floods, storing carbon, influencing climate, providing wildlife habitat and recreational opportunities, treating wastewater, providing food and shelter. There's a whole host of social, economical, environmental goods and services that they provide. Wetlands have been and continue to be undervalued and are under constant threat from human and natural disturbances, including drainage, resource exploration and extraction, wildfire, and climate change associated impacts. So there's a whole host of things that can happen to our wetlands. If you're interested in wetland policy in particular, there's a couple of good web pages that you can visit. One is wetlandpolicy.ca, there's albertawetlands.ca. There's also a riparian policy website that Equality has done up. And the bottom is the Twitter feed for Equality, and all things to do with wetlands and water in Alberta are tweeted out as soon as they're found out about. So if there's any changes in water policy or wetland policy, it's tweeted out there. So that's another resource for us. That is 90 minutes.